Mr. Horowitz, thank you for being here, and to all of your team. You've done important work, so thank you to all of you in the rows 1 and 2 as well. There are a number of things that are really troubling, but some of them have been unpacked pretty fully so far, so I'm going to pick up some loose ends. Bruce Orr, who is he, and what's his role at the department? And then let's ask some questions about the bizarre pathway by which he became involved in this investigation.
So at the time of these events, he was an associate deputy attorney general and the head of the Organized Crime Drug Enforcement Task Force, working out of the deputy attorney general's office.
The Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force. And that's connected to election interference by the Russians. How?
It is not.
What the hell's he doing here?
That was precisely the concern, which that we lay out here. He had no role in any of the election interference matters.
We have a bunch of people in the media who wanted to read this as a Rorschach test, and they wanted to have a predetermined answer for exactly how to interpret each piece of this. And so as the chairman began today, he said, predicate of investigation appropriate, but some minor mistakes and errors were made. You've outlined in this 478 or 434, depending on whether we count all the Roman numerals, page report, 17 significant errors in this investigation. Bruce Orr, who has a very significant senior role, ODAG, for those who don't know, the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, has primary oversight of all law enforcement agencies in America. So if you're in the FBI and you might make a mistake in your investigation, the people you'd be in trouble with normally are in the Deputy Attorney General's office. And here's a guy in the Deputy Attorney General's office who ultimately gets involved, inserts himself into this investigation. And I think it's pretty important to recognize we've got a massive cultural systemic failure. If a guy from ODAG, who should be doing oversight of this case, if he weren't off on another assignment about organized crime and drug trafficking, if he were going to get involved in this, he should be checking the work of the people who were doing the work. And there are a whole bunch of department protocols and provisions that were violated throughout this. But Bruce Orr, he ultimately decides to get extra information out of Christopher Steele after Christopher Steele or his employer, Fusion GPS, had been cut off by the FBI. Why did the FBI decide to no longer listen to Christopher Steele?
So he was closed in November of 2016 after the FBI learned of his disclosure to Mother Jones magazine that he had been working with the FBI previously.
And we know from the evidence that Senator Cruz went through, there were a whole bunch of subsources that Christopher Steele was summarizing, and the FBI at that point was believing he might be a credible guy. And they ultimately realized that this is a bunch of BS, and his subsources are saying, I said some of this in jest, and some of it's stuff that I overheard in a bar. None of it is information that I had firsthand knowledge of. And so the FBI decides, reasonably, that Mr. Steele's information isn't credible, right? So they cut him off.
Actually, let me just be clear. That isn't what caused them to cut him off. What caused them to cut him off is they learned he had talked to the press in Mother Jones magazine. They actually had that other information and didn't tell anybody about it.
Okay, so so you're disagreeing with me only to say the problems with Mr. Steele are twice as bad as I summarized.
I'm just saying that isn't why they cut him off.
Okay.
Right? That's the concern, is that
so then Bruce Orr, who doesn't have any responsibilities in this area, decides he'll insert himself into the investigation and go get additional information from or about Christopher Steele and the people who are funding Christopher Steele. Can you just remind us, who's Bruce Orr married to?
Bruce Orr's spouse, Nellie Orr, had formerly been, at the time he started interacting in November 2016 with Steele, had been a former independent contractor for Fusion GPS.
So in other words, Bruce Orr decides to insert himself into an investigation after the professional agents involved in this investigation said Mr. Steele isn't reputable, isn't credible, and has been talking to the media. So we're now not going to talk to Christopher Steele anymore. Bruce Orr says, actually, I should. And he meets with these people who are funding or who are the employers of Christopher Steele or own his dossier, who's also Bruce Orr's wife's source of compensation.
Had been. As
okay.
of, I think, September 2016, she had no longer been an independent contractor. And I want to also, I think it's important to be clear, because this is relevant, again, to the significance of some of the inappropriate actions here. The FBI was not a reluctant participant in this relationship that was the conduit from Bruce Orr, through Bruce Orr to Steele, as we lay out here. So okay. I just want to be clear. They're not saying, we don't want to deal with him. They're saying, oh, yeah, essentially, if you have something, we would love to hear from you.
I want to just say that I wish Mike Lee weren't sitting here 2 people away from me right now, because as a national security hawk, I have argued with Mike Lee in the 4.5 or 5 years that I've been in the Senate that stuff just like this couldn't possibly happen at the FBI and at the Department of Justice. So as somebody who is embarrassed on behalf of the FBI about your report, because I believe that it is critically important that we have the FISA statute. I think the FISC is an incredibly important court. The approval rating of applications that come before the FISC are off the charts. I don't know the current numbers, but a couple years ago when I saw them, I think it was 97.9%. Is that a fair?
I think was the last number I saw was roughly 98%.
Okay, so a 98% approval rating of applications that come before the FISC. Why would it be that high? People would normally say, and I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm saying that the good answer is, in an ex parte, I'm not an attorney, but an ex parte proceeding before the court, when you, the American citizen who might be being surveilled or be suspected of something that would open a surveillance warrant against you, the assumption would be, if you can't be there to defend yourself, it's because the department's lawyers are so super scrupulous that if there's any information that might exonerate you or that might counteract the view that led them to first pursue a theory of the case that had them wanting to surveil you, they would say the bar is so high here, we'll always err on the side of privacy unless we believe there's a good reason to pursue this investigation. And so Mike Lee has warned me for 4.5 years, the potential for abuse in this space is terrible, and I constantly defended the integrity and the professionalism of the Bureau and of the department that you couldn't have something like this happen. Let's move on from Bruce Orr and move to the renewals. The renewals, the first one we can have a debate about. That's been the headline about whether or not there was political bias that led to the opening of the investigation. The second, the third, and the fourth warrant against, or FISA proceeding against Carter Page are based on an assumption the court has that, hey, we got a bunch of information the first time we heard this case, and if we thought it was legitimate to open a case into this guy, the Bureau is going to have so much integrity and the department's lawyers are going to have so much integrity. If there's ever a reason for them to doubt information that led to the opening application they made to us, they'll bring us that information. So in renewals 2, 3, and 4, they bring none of this information, right?
That's correct. They're not telling the department, so the lawyers at the department can decide what to include for the court.
So I think we face a massive crisis of public trust in American life in general, partly because an open society is going to be susceptible to the kinds of influence operations that Russia runs against us on a daily basis in a clunky way, but that China is eventually going to run against us in a very sophisticated way. The real debate we should be having on TV and in the print journalist community about moments like this is not fundamentally about making this month 48 or month 49 of the 2016 presidential election that will never die. We should be having an advanced conversation about 2024, 2028, and 2032 when China with deep fakes runs influence operations against us that are going to be far more sophisticated and far more dangerous than this. And so if the Bureau functions this poorly during a moment like this, when we actually have a really sophisticated attack against the U.S., we're going to have a much, much bigger problem if the American people don't think they can trust this. And so whether or not people are going to agree with your opening headline on whether or not political bias was a relevant factor in the opening in the investigation, there is no doubt that there's a massive cultural failing inside DOJ and at the FBI that would allow renewals to come in the second, third, and the fourth case without anybody ever thinking that their work is going to be scrutinized again. If this is what happens, and this is arguably the second, third, or fourth most important investigation in the history of the FBI, if this can happen in an investigation where they would expect there's going to be a lot of subsequent scrutiny, what is your suspicion about what happens in a regular FISA application or renewal process? If the American people hear this and they say this can happen against a campaign for the presidency of the United States, what happens in an ordinary FISA case?
That was exactly our concern and why we started this week a new review and audit to look at others, not only on the intel side, counterintelligence side, but on the counterterrorism side and on U.S. persons. What else is going on there? We want to be fair. We don't want to do it just on this, but for the reasons you indicated, if it's happening here, what's going on elsewhere?
I want to summarize something that you say on page 14, which is to this point, because so many people are just reading this hearing or listening to this hearing through the lenses of who their favorite red or blue jersey team was in the 2016 election. But you're saying something really fundamental about a culture that Director Wray needs to rebuild. Quote, there are so many basic and fundamental errors, were made by 3 separate hand-picked teams on one of the most sensitive FBI investigations that was briefed to the highest levels within the FBI, and that the FBI officials expected would eventually be subjected to close scrutiny, raised significant questions regarding the FBI chain of command's management and supervision of the FISA process. Jumping ahead, in our view, this was a failure of not only the operational team, but also of the managers and the supervisors, including the senior officials in the chain of command. For these reasons, we recommend that the FBI review of the performance of these employees and who had the responsibility for the preparation, the Woods review, which is essentially where you check your work and you say, do we have any footnotes and could we corroborate this if we had to, if asked by the FISA court or other supervisors, or, picking up your quote again, approval of the FISA applications as well as the managers and supervisors in the chain of command of the Carter Page investigation, including senior officials, and take appropriate action, action deemed appropriate. This means potential discipline and firing, I assume. In addition, given the extensive compliance failures we identified in this review, we believe that additional OIG oversight work is required to assess the FBI's compliance with the department and FBI FISA-related policies that seek to protect the civil liberties of the U.S. persons, also known as the whole Fourth Amendment. Accordingly, we have today initiated, this is a big headline, folks, and accordingly, today we have initiated an OIG audit that will further examine the FBI's compliance with the Woods procedures in FISA applications that target U.S. persons in both counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. That's a big headline. You're saying there is a systematic cultural failure of accountability at the Bureau related to the FISA process. Mike Lee doesn't drink, but I'd buy him whiskey right now if he did, because there are a whole bunch of things we've argued about for a long time, and he's right about things that I think ought not be right. And if we had another 10-minute round, Lindsay's round was 94 minutes, so I'm going to go over by at least 25 seconds. If we had time for another round, I think we should ask some really fundamental questions about the defensive briefing as well. In the American system, when the people get to pick politicians to represent them, for a time, the politicians aren't better people than the bureaucrats, but they're the ones who hold certificates of election. When the people are elected, those politicians incoming don't know as much as the bureaucrats at the top levels of the agencies because the agency experts have been there for a long time. That's what the defensive briefing should be about, not an investigatory Trojan horse.